Good morning. Welcome to the Wednesday Science Talk and also the Wednesday lecture on string theory. So you've got a good day. This will be a good day. Well, we hope a good day for science. I'm Bob Spiritus. I coordinate this program. Bob Hopper, our president, is in the back somewhere. He just ducked out, but he's around. Teresa Cameraman's over here in our group, and we're happy to have you with us. Zach is back there making magic happen with the computer, and I think Allison Hopper is out there somewhere doing good things. Today we're happy to have Dr. Ralph Walton present. He began his career at the University of Rochester School of Medicine as an assistant professor of psychiatry and clinical director of one of the inpatient units, and was the founding director of the University of Rochester's Strong Memorial Hospital Drug and Alcohol Treatment Program. His first academic paper was on smoking and alcoholism. It was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Subsequent publications were in the areas of depression, opiate dependence, post-traumatic cognitive deficits, and the artificial sweetener aspartame. His claim to fame was, his claims of fraud, I got that a little wrong. Sorry about that, that was unintentional. It had to do with the approval process, the FDA approval process of aspartame, resulting in a lot of controversy and an interview with Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes. That was in 1966. At the time of his retirement, he was a professor and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Northeastern Ohio University College of Medicine, and his connection to Chautauqua only goes back 70 years. He's been a 70-year resident of Chautauqua. Please welcome a Chautauqua young old-timer, Dr. Ralph Walton.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to also thank Bob for preparing these slides. I've never actually given a PowerPoint presentation before, believe it or not, despite being in the academic world for most of my professional life. I've been involved in this issue of fraud in medical research for close to 40 years now. It's my hope that if I share some of that journey with you, some of you may become as passionate about it as I have been, but hopefully more effective in bringing about change. It's been a very frustrating sort of fight. I'd like to tell you, before we get to the slides, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I got there. I certainly didn't begin my career as a researcher. After I completed my internship and residency, I did join the full-time faculty of Rochester's Medical School, University of Rochester. But I was on the clinical track, not the research track. In other words, I had an office in Strong Memorial Hospital where I saw outpatients. I was the director of one of the inpatient units, but I was not primarily involved in research. My boss, however, at the time, Lyman Wynn, was one of the world's most well-known and respected researchers in schizophrenia. And Lyman approached me one day and asked me if I would be willing to take care of his cousin by marriage, who coincidentally was a Chautauquan. Many of you probably know her and her family. She did give me permission to actually use her name, her real name. She wanted it used because she didn't want other people to go through what she had experienced, and she wanted what happened to her to be widely known, but I'm not comfortable giving her actual name. I'll refer to her as Mary D. Mary D was then a 54-year-old woman who had a long history of recurrent major depressive episodes. She was being treated by a psychoanalyst in Buffalo. When I saw her, she fulfilled all the criteria for major depression. And the standard of care, both then and now, was not for psychoanalysis, for clear-cut, severe major depression. The standard of care was for some psychotherapy, but also for the use of an antidepressant medication. So I put Mary on an old so-called tricyclic antidepressant, a medication called imipramine, trade name Tofranil. Within about 3 weeks, she was fine. All of her depressive signs and symptoms had resolved. And I kept Mary on that antidepressant for several months And then I try to do what I usually do with people who are on meds, try tapering and seeing if they can do okay without the medication. Once I tapered and discontinued it, her depressive symptoms came back full force. So I reinstated her imipramine. We tried that several cycles, and each time I took her off the medication, she relapsed into a severe major depression. So she and I together made the decision that we would maintain her for life on an antidepressant. And I saw her for a several-year period. Then I was recruited to come to this area by people you might know, actually, Joe Gerasi and Stan Lundeen. They brought me to Chautauqua County to be Commissioner of Mental Health and to run the inpatient unit at the Jamestown General Hospital, a facility that has since closed. One day I got a call from the chief of internal medicine at Jamestown General, Dr. Robert Weddingfeld, and he was the internist for Mary. And he said, "Ralph, you've got to come and see Mary. Something odd has happened." She was admitted to the hospital because she had a grand mal seizure. And that was certainly unusual for a woman of 54 without a history of epilepsy, with no history of a stroke, no history of brain trauma. I went to see her in the hospital, and indeed she was different. She was manic. She spoke a mile a minute, was grandiose, ideas flitting from one thing to another, a clearly manic presentation. And this puzzled me because she'd never been manic before. Now, bipolar disorder certainly can present at age 54, but that would be very, very unlikely. Usually it presents in the 20s or 30s, not at age 54. And also a seizure was, I couldn't explain it, nor could Bob Weddingfeld. He did a CAT scan and the imaging showed no stroke, no sign of brain trauma. So the seizure and her mania were totally inexplicable. This was a mystery to us. She and I decided to do some detective work together. What was different in her life? And the only thing that we could pinpoint as being different was that she had been very heavy and always drank a lot of iced tea in the summer, always sweetened with sugar. But because of her weight concern, she decided to switch to a new substance that just introduced into the market called Crystal Light. Crystal Light was aspartame. And we thought maybe this substance had something to do with her grand mal seizure and her sudden manic episodes. I didn't know anything about this new agent at the time, but I went to the library and did some research, found that most of the good, solid scientific research on this new substance, this new artificial sweetener, had been done actually at MIT by Richard Wertman, who was the director of the Brain Sciences department of MIT. And he wrote about the fact that aspartame was a so-called methyl ester of a dipeptide. That is, it's the organic salt of two amino acids stuck together, phenylalanine and aspartic acid. And he wrote that this new substance could induce neurochemical changes within the brain. Because phenylalanine, one of the two amino acids in aspartame, is a precursor for the so-called catecholamines, for norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine. And when aspartame is given with a carbohydrate-rich meal, aside from increasing catecholamines, it impairs the absorption of L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan is an amino acid which is the building block for serotonin. So according to Richard Wertman, it can change the catecholamine-indolamine balance in the brain. One of the things that could theoretically do is lower seizure threshold, and increasing catecholamines could potentially trigger a manic episode. We certainly didn't have the definitive answers to what's going on chemically in the brain, but we did know that in mania, there was an increase in catecholamines, in synaptic catecholamines. So this made sense to me that perhaps her seizure and manic episode could be attributable to aspartame. Again, this is a single case report, but I thought this was so clear to me that I had to try and publish something about this. Now again, single case reports are not really respected in the medical world. What is respected are double-blind studies. But I thought this really needs to be known. So I wrote it up, and it has some speculation here that aspartame might be a substance that could induce seizures and could induce problems for people with mood disorders. I didn't know if it would be published or not, because again, it was based on a single patient. Throughout medical history, though, medical progress was made by single case reports, physicians observing what happened to their patients. I was surprised, actually, when it was accepted for publication by one of the major journals, by Psychosomatics. And shortly after its publication, I received a telephone call from the Richard Wertman that I mentioned a moment ago, the man who had done so much research on aspartame and was head of MIT's Center for Brain Sciences. And he asked me if I had any other patients who had a similar experience, had seizures. I said, no, I didn't, but I'd be on the lookout for that. And he asked me to call him back if I had more patients with seizures that I could attribute to aspartame. I didn't in my practice at that point. But I happened at that point in time to be the president of the medical staff at Jamestown General and also president of the local medical society. So at meetings of these two groups, I asked if any physicians had patients with seizures that they could not explain, to please refer them to me. And I got quite a collection of patients, many of whom I thought had seizures because of their use of aspartame. When I had quite a collection, a large number, I called Wertman back. And he said that MIT was organizing an international conference on dietary phenylalanine and brain function. And would I be willing to present a paper at that conference in Washington? I told him that I would be happy to do so. And that conference was the beginning of my exposure to the effects of greed or fraud in medical research. Because when I arrived in Washington at my hotel, I met with several other researchers, and I met with a group from Temple University who were going to present a paper the next day on their hypothesis that the use of aspartame complicated the control of glucose in diabetic patients. When I arrived at the hotel with my wife, we were approached by two lobbyists who said they were representing the NutraSweet company and they wanted to take me to dinner and my wife to dinner. I refused that invitation. But we were in the hotel's restaurant when I saw those same researchers that I'd met with earlier that day, but they were with the lobbyists from the NutraSweet company. The next day, their paper was pulled. It was never presented. That was my beginning suspicion that there was perhaps something not quite kosher going on here. After I presented that paper, Richard Wertman said that MIT was going to be publishing a book on dietary phenylalanine and brain function, and would I be willing to write the chapter on seizures and aspartame? I said again that I'd be happy to do that, and I did so, and that there's a big fat textbook called Dietary Phenylalanine and Brain Function. I contributed chapter 18, which is the chapter on seizures. There was, however, a lot of criticism of my work because it was all based on, not just single, I had quite a large number of people with seizures, but it wasn't a double-blind study by any means. These were so-called anecdotal material. The important papers all were double-blind studies. So I decided that I had to also do a double-blind study on aspartame. In order to do a double-blind study on this artificial sweetener, I couldn't just go to the store and buy equal packets or Crystal Light, because these commercially available products are cut with other ingredients. Yes, there's aspartame in it, but there are other ingredients. So you have to have so-called USP grade aspartame in order to do a valid scientific study. getting USP-grade aspartame wasn't all that easy. The NutraSweet company said that they would provide USP-grade aspartame for any legitimate researcher. I applied for that aspartame, and it was refused. At that point in time, I was a full professor and a chairman in a major medical school. I think I qualified as legitimate. In retrospect, I'm sort of happy that they wouldn't sell it to me. It was very difficult. I actually called local bottlers because they get USP-grade aspartame that they put into their Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi and so forth. And from each company, I was told that they were instructed not to sell it to me. So it was very difficult to get. We did finally get it from Schweitzer. A European company sold us USP-grade aspartame. So we did the double-blind study. This was a study in which we had both controls and a cohort of people who had mood disorders. It was my hypothesis that people with mood disorders would be especially vulnerable to adverse effects from NutraSweet. So I took a group of 20 people with mood disorders who were willing to participate in the study, and 20 controls, 20 people who had no psychiatric history at all. And we took only people who said they had no knowledge of any adverse effects from NutraSweet. And we did a crossover study where we gave people first a week's worth of aspartame. I gave them 30 milligrams per kilogram. The FDA says that 50 milligrams per kilogram per day is safe, so I stayed below that level. I stayed at 30. And people got either aspartame or a placebo, not knowing which was which, and the groups were switched over so that the group that got aspartame in one arm of the study would then get the placebo and so forth. Anyway, after a few days of the study, our medical school IRB, that is the Institutional Review Board, halted the study because of the severity of side effects on some of the people. Several people complained that felt they were poisoned. One man actually had to be life-flighted because he had a sudden intraocular hemorrhage, a bleed in his eye, and he lost the vision in one eye. He was blind in one eye. And this occurred during the aspartame arm of the study, the third day of the aspartame arm. I forgot to mention that a biochemist by the name of Woodrow Monty had written about the fact that since aspartame is a methyl ester of a dipeptide, that component, the methyl ester component, is metabolized in the human body into methanol, wood alcohol. Many of you probably realize that wood alcohol causes blindness, causes major problems with the eye. And we had one man who lost his vision. Actually, he was a psychologist who was the director of one of our inpatient units, was the psychologist for an inpatient unit, good friend, and he was blind in one eye as a result, I'm sure, of our study. So the IRB stopped the study, and we didn't have everybody going through it, so we had a smaller N, and I figured that's the end of the study. We'll never get this published. But our statistician pointed out that even though the N was smaller than we would have liked, it was still highly statistically significant. So I submitted the paper, and it was published in Biological Psychiatry, which is a major journal in the field. And it was shortly after that publication that my secretary received a telephone call from a man identifying himself as Isidore Rosmarin, a producer for 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes, they said, was going to do a story on aspartame. Would I be willing to be involved in that? I thought at first that this was one of my friends pulling a prank. I didn't think that 60 Minutes would be calling me. And I said, when my secretary gave the phone to me, I said that to this Isidore, that I didn't believe that he was from 60 Minutes. And he said, would you recognize the voice of Mike Wallace? And he put Mike Wallace on the phone at that point, and I knew it was real. I worked with the 60 Minutes folks for over a year. Isidore Russman actually came to town and we worked together. This was very controversial within 60 Minutes. Don Hewitt, the producer, did not want to do the story because they had recently been sued by the tobacco industry. They'd done a story on smoking and were sued. He did not want to go through all that again. He was convinced that the sweetener industry would sue them. Mike Wallace very much wanted to do the story, so there was this conflict. Don Hewitt, do you remember that name? He was a difficult man, a lot of swearing. He swore at me a lot. And Mike Wallace was fun to work with, actually. Although the night when I had to go to New York to tape the interview, I was up all night the night before, feeling that I'd likely be given this very difficult interview. You know, Mike Wallace was known for being somebody who was quite aggressive as an interviewer, but he was not. We'd worked together over the year, and he was very kind. He also told me that he himself suffered from major depression, and he owed his life to taking the antidepressant sertraline. I was hoping that that would be in the story, because we chatted a lot about his depression. Unfortunately, it was cut, and so a lot of my material was cut. I was in the story, but I'll get into that in a minute. But just the week before the story was to be aired, John Olney, a researcher at Washington University, published a paper that aspartame causes brain cancer in some patients. There was a remarked increase in brain lymphomas, a rare sort of tumor, but he attributed that to the use of aspartame and showed statistically that it was likely that aspartame was the culprit. And that was a little more fancy than my claim that it made depressions worse. So I was in the story, but a lot of the story was then on brain tumors. During our preparation for the story, Mike Wallace said, "Dr. Walton, you claim that aspartame is such a hazardous substance, yet there are so many studies, the FDA approved it, and so many studies showing it's perfectly safe." I said, "Well, you've got to look, Mike, at who paid for these studies." I said, just about all of the studies that attest to the safety of aspartame were funded by the industry. And there are even more studies out there that did not receive industry funding, and just about every one of them identifies a problem. Mike turned to me and said, "Prove it." So I set out to try and prove that, and what I did is we pulled every single study that had relevance for human safety and looked at the funding source. And indeed, every single study that showed it was safe was paid for by the industry, either by the NutraSweet company or the Life Sciences Institute, which is a front for the NutraSweet, for the aspartame industry. So either directly or indirectly, there was funding from the industry. And we got hundreds of studies that did not, let me just show you, Bob prepared all these slides for me, so I don't want to not show them. These are the industry funded, what we did is, on this chart, I designated the study and whether or not it was found to be safe. And as you can see, every single one was found to be safe. Hundreds of studies. I'll just go through all of these. And you don't need to look at the individual studies, but you can, or the funding, but most of it is NutraSweet or the International Life Sciences. This chart, by the way, was on 60 Minutes, if any of you saw that story. And then we looked at the non-industry sponsored research. And you can find that just about every single study that had independent funding was sponsored, found that there was one or more problems. Remarkable, isn't it? That every single independently funded study shows that there was a problem. The only exceptions were a couple of studies funded by the FDA. And the FDA, as Bob mentioned, has a very, very controversial history with regard to funding, with regard to aspartame. I mentioned a few moments ago a biochemist who talks a lot about methanol, wood alcohol, and aspartame. He's considered the world's expert on this field. He was the chairman of Food Sciences Division at Arizona State University for many years. And I'd followed his papers, he followed mine, so we contacted each other. And a few years ago, we actually did a study together, and we published a paper in Medical Hypotheses, a study on dietary methanol and autism. We both believed strongly, and I think we sort of demonstrated the possibility in this paper. I mention him now because, and in the context of fraud, he had something worse than fraud occur to him. As I said, he'd written for many years about the hazards of aspartame. And after he'd published several papers, his laboratory at Arizona State University was firebombed. No person was ever charged with that arson. And a few months after his laboratory bombing, his house was set on fire. Again, arson, with nobody ever being accountable for that, nobody ever charged for that. He now lives in New Zealand. But this is dangerous stuff. Fortunately, I haven't had anything like that happen to me. But it's been so many years. My first paper on this was published in 1986. And it's still on the market, although there have been recent papers that have been published. I'd like to open it up for, there's so much more here, but I don't want to bore all of you, and I'm sure many of you have questions, so let's go to some questions and answers. Yes?
This goes back to the first talk of the week.
Please come to the mic so that
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, okay, hang on. Can I just ask you to delay it for a couple of minutes? Because there's something else that I want to, Bob's slides reminded me. This is really very important, too. After the 60 Minutes story, the NutraSweet company released a bibliography of hundreds of studies that they said claimed that this substance is totally safe. Again, I pulled, with the help of medical students and residents, I pulled all of those studies from the bibliography. And some fascinating things emerged when I looked at those actual papers. You know, when you submit a paper for publication in a medical or scientific journal, you have to sign an affidavit that this study has not been submitted for publication elsewhere. And what we found is that study after study had multiple publications, multiple journals, often exactly the same paper, maybe changed a word here or there. And they'd often change the order of the authors. In other words, they take turns being the primary author. But essentially the same paper, published over and over and over again. Sometimes 7 or 8 times for the same paper. And there's one set that I want to look at. I don't know if I can find it here. Well, I'm not sure. Bob kindly did so many slides, I'm not even sure exactly where the slide is. What I wanted to really show you was that there was one study that was absolutely remarkable. There were supposedly two different papers. Yet the sets of data in two totally different studies, supposedly. One where rats were fed protein-carbohydrate combination, another where they were given fats, etc., and aspartame. But the numbers that were cited were identical, even though they were supposedly totally separate studies. There was like a 7.86 and a 7.86, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's in one of the slides. I don't want to take the time now to actually find that. But I found this over and over again, that there's so much clear evidence of fraud when you look at the papers, when you look at the fact that the same data, the same papers appear over and over and over again. So the fraud is clear, it's evident, and then I think that if an author signs an affidavit that he has not submitted it elsewhere, and then you find it in 8 different journals, can you trust the data? Can you trust the conclusions? I'll leave it to your common sense. Okay, now I'm sorry I've gone back, but now let's get to the questions.
I have a question from the chat from Bob Davidson. Aspartame is again in the news because the World Health Organization suggests it is a possible cancer agent. The FDA disagrees that it causes cancer when used in the usual way. How does one decide whom to believe?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, you've got to use your common sense, folks. There's so much. I was telling Bob before, there's a researcher named Armando Sofriti, whom I met when I went to Parma. Yeah, I've got to share this with you too. I was asked to testify before EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority. And when I was waiting to give my testimony, I saw the same lobbyists that I'd encountered over and over again, and I saw the same researchers who had industry-funded studies. So I was pretty clear, pretty sure what the outcome of that would be, of what EFSA would decide. I also did some research and discovered that several members of that committee, of the EFSA committee, had direct ties to the NutraSweet industry, to the aspartame industry. That's been written about by others, not by me. But there is literature out there demonstrating that these people are allied with the NutraSweet industry.
I worked in a medical setting as a social worker, and I recall very few opportunities to buy my own lunch. So my experience is consistent with yours. At the beginning of this week, the speaker, the CEO of Dow Jones and publisher of Wall Street Journal, talked about trust as a business product. He also emphasized a line between news and opinion, therefore avoiding any conflict. My response to that was, that's impossible. And the same with this, that without a totally uninvolved researcher, it's impossible to arrive at a adequate.
Yes, I agree.
Have you ever worked with the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and what's your view on their reliable
I haven't worked with them, but I get their material, yes, and I'm familiar with their material, and I respect it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I, before we get to the next question, there's so much that I wanted to share, but haven't, but there's one other thing that I think is important that I'd like to share with you now, too. I was asked a few years ago to testify before Parliament. I received a telephone call from a young lady with a strong British accent saying that she worked for Roger Williams, a member of Parliament and the chair of the Food Safety Committee of Parliament. And would I be willing to work with them and possibly come to England to testify before the House of Commons? What had occurred is that Roger Williams, a member of Parliament from Wales, had received a telephone call from one of his constituents, a high school science teacher. Her son had experienced a grand mal seizure, and the pediatrician felt he had epilepsy and put him on Dilantin. The science teacher mother wasn't convinced that her son was epileptic and didn't really want to commit him to a lifetime of anticonvulsants. So she, being scientifically minded, did her own sort of investigation as to what was different in her son's life. And her son was getting a little heavy. And he decided to switch from regular soft drinks to diet soft drinks. And she wondered whether aspartame could have caused his seizure. And again, being a scientifically minded individual, she did her own little study. She took him off all diet drinks, made sure he had no aspartame, and then she reintroduced a diet drink, gave him a diet cola, and he had another seizure. So she was convinced that it had to be the aspartame that induced the seizure in her son, and she was so convinced of this that she contacted her member of parliament, Roger Williams, and he went to the literature, found my studies, and hence they called me. And I worked with Roger Williams for a week, and again, I encountered the same lobbyists. I kept meeting the same people over and over and over again. So I knew that we spent 1 week together working on the legislation. He and I put together that law, and it was a law outlawing, banning aspartame in the United Kingdom. And we cited all the research. When you present legislation in the House of Commons, you have to have stuff to back it up. So we worked very hard on that. I knew it wouldn't pass because I'd seen the lobbyists, but we did get 47 members of parliament to vote for it, which I was amazed at. So again, let's get back to questions.
When I was in medical school, I became concerned with how much research was going on, and this was in the 80s, at universities that was funded by companies, either drug companies or whatever. I am more and more concerned as I get older, as I get more cynical, about the lack of government funding for our medical research, which hopefully would be more independent. On the other hand, we also know that that's not necessarily true, and that many studies are funded by multiple agencies, including the government funds.
Yes, the FDA, boy, don't know where to start with the FDA on this. At the time of the aspartame approvals, the FDA had a group, an internal committee, to look at this, a group of scientists, and their recommendation to the commissioner of the FDA was that aspartame not be funded. They found too many potential problems with it. The commissioner at the time was Arthur Hull Hayes, and he overruled his own internal committee and single-handedly, as the commissioner, approved aspartame. And within months after that approval, he left and took a job with the public relations arm of the NutraSweet company. Okay. Go ahead.
Congratulations on staying the course, and thank you for an outstanding presentation. Question, in addition to diet sodas and Equal and NutraSweet, what else contains aspartame?
Well, all sorts of things contain. You've got to really read labels carefully. You'd be surprised where aspartame is. It's in all sorts of products. It's even in medications, okay? Even some anticonvulsants have aspartame in them, which is nuts. So please read labels very carefully. Yes?
First, I would like to thank you for your persistence and drive for truth. Question I have, I am kind of curious. You mentioned 30 milligram per kilogram.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
You mentioned that you were using 30 milligram per kilogram per dose.
We use 30
research.
Milligrams per kilogram per day.
Per day, yeah. How that equivalent, or how many packages?
Oh, okay.
So we will have.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's equivalent to about 6 or 7 diet colas a day. So it's quite a bit, but it's within the realm of what people actually do. Okay, it's not outrageously high.
basically for a week, let's say once a day, that's equal to, okay, that
Okay.
helps.
No, 6 or 7 per day, not per week.
Right, I understand,
Yeah,
but total collective, right, thank you. Also, in functional medicine, I am MD, but I'm curious about functional medicine, what's interesting, so I read the literature. It's a very well-known fact and published and spread knowledge about exactly what you were talking about. So people who are interested in, besides practicing Western medicine, but also to open eyes what else going on, it's a very well-known fact. So that's why I wanted to mention that. Another question I have, what's your impression of what you know about Europe? I have, to my knowledge, that it's basically not recommended for use in European countries.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what it is. What's the substance or product you're referring to?
Aspartame.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That it's not recommended for usage in Europe.
Well, no, it is. See, the FDA of Europe, the European Union, is the European Food Safety Authority. That's the group that I testified before. And it is approved. It is approved in Europe.
I see.
Yeah.
And the very...
My efforts there failed, and I knew that they would.
Sorry
but
to
they
hear
failed.
that. Sorry.
EFSA has the same recommendation as the FDA, that it's safe.
And just I want to finish with curious observation. We were having breakfast with my daughter at home and my 15-year-old granddaughter. And she was putting aspartame. It's just last week. And I told her that, honey, this is not good for you. And my daughter knows that very well. So she said, oh, no, that grandmother is right. She looked at me, she looked at my daughter, and she said, for your age, it's bad. For our age, it's good. Thank you so much.
Yes, Bob.
There was another talk on science this week at Chautauqua that stressed over and over again that without numbers, you can't have science and you have to measure things. And science does depend on being able to observe and measure. But Einstein didn't have numbers for relativity. But my question, I love it. The New York Times and the Washington Post have once a week a science section, and they have some journalists who specialize in it. And they will have a little column each week called something like On the Numbers, and they will synthesize a recent medical research study. And they'll describe it for us in a paragraph and have some general vague conclusion and then drop it. And then 3 months later, some other group will have come out with a study and there'll be a little thing. And there's no follow-on and there's no comparison. I think the media is not explaining medical research well to us. And I don't know, how do we get them to do a better job? Do you have any ideas?
I wish I knew the answer to that, Bob. I've been trying for 40 years. Because, I thought that when the 60 Minutes story aired, that would be the end of NutraSweet. Boy, was I wrong.
Well, at least we have stevia.
That might be actually, I always thought that was totally safe, and there's some evidence that might not be that great either.
This is another question from the chat from Bob Davidson. Given the nearly 60 years of general use of aspartame, has there been a noticeable general increase in brain problems?
There has been a general increase in brain problems, absolutely. Some of that, I'm convinced some of that is due to the very widespread use of aspartame. The diet products are everywhere. And I think that obviously, the increase in psychiatric illness has many, many causes, but I believe that the widespread use of aspartame is one of many. And that's what John Olney wrote about so well from Washington University, that the increase in brain tumors, he believes, is attributable to aspartame. And there has been, nobody questions that, there has been a massive increase worldwide in brain tumors. I think probably aspartame is one of many factors that's responsible for that. Yes?
I want to thank you for an excellent presentation, and particularly for your lifelong work and dedication. I have observed that and one of the things I would say is, I think you're very humble in saying that you have not made much progress in this area, because there is some progress being made. I know that at this point, in scientific or medical presentations at least, and in medical publications, the authors have to certify where they are funded and what types of funding they have, and what their conflicts of interests are. And I wanted to ask you, where would you prioritize where we should go further to advance the anti-fraud situation, and how should we go about it?
I wish I knew the answers as to how to go about it. I've been trying for so many years. I think, I don't know. I just honestly don't know. My hope is that some of you will have some answers. Some of you will be able to make some noise and perhaps have a greater impact than I have had.
Okay.
But I don't know.
And do you have priorities where we should go? And
well, you're all very bright. I'm sure you can you can figure it out perhaps better than I can. I've been trying and trying, and we still have the problem.
get rid of the lobbyists.
Yeah. That's not going to happen, though.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm a clinician scientist and appreciate case reports because I think they help flag things that we should investigate further. So I appreciate your case reports. I'm also an editor and wanted to note that conflict of interest remains real and important. And it biases the way people design, conduct, and interpret research. And so we have to guard against it. And when we're reading stories in the newspaper, we should look and see who it was funded by.
Yes.
And if it's funded by industry, that should raise a red flag for us to be cautious. Medical science is taking some steps to try and counter this. So for example, if you're funded by the federal government, and some journals require this, now you have to make your primary data available in a database. So the group I work with, PCORI, the investigators give us their data that we put in a database that other people can access and reanalyze. You have to contribute your statistical code so that statisticians can review it and see if it was proper and if they can replicate the results. And if they can't, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And so I think we're taking some steps to try and limit bias and to detect fraud. Some statisticians are actually using statistical software now to reanalyze papers that are published and see if the results even make sense, and finding out when they don't make sense and challenging the authors. And so I think there's safeguards that we're growing in how robust they are, but we need to keep the pressure on because it's important. Science is imperfect, and it takes some time to get at our best estimate of truth possible, and we certainly don't want that progress being slowed down by deliberate bias and fraud.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, as I was listening, you have enormous amounts of studies that you've gathered and listed here. I was wondering if somehow or other artificial intelligence might help you identify more summaries of information. If you were to, for example, go to ChatGPT, which is a site that's available, I think, to any layperson, and put in a question dealing with aspartame, do you think information like this would come back? Do you understand
that's a
my
very good
question?
thought. It's an excellent thought, yeah. One that I had not considered, but yeah, AI might be very useful here.
Hi. Are there any sweeteners, artificial sweeteners or semi-artificial sweeteners that, in your view, are safe? You alluded to the fact that even stevia may have some problems.
Yeah, you know, I'm not an expert on the others, but the others, for example, sucralose is also used a lot. And that's the same element that's used in dry cleaning fluids. I mean, you can postulate that it's should be quite toxic. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm skeptical about all of the artificial sweeteners, I really am. You know, there was obvious concern many years ago about bladder cancer and saccharin, and just about every artificial sweetener, there have been some potential problems raised with. I don't know of any that is totally safe. You know, sugar is, well, it's 16 calories per teaspoon, right? So use it cautiously. But I think it's safer than any of the artificial sweeteners. Although we know more and more now, we're becoming cognizant of the tremendous damage done just by sugar, too, by too much sugar.
The papers that you have referenced, are these university-based research organizations, or are they public?
Many of them are, many of them aren't, yeah. It's a mix.
It's a mix from all.
It's a mix, yes.
Thank you for a good presentation. I would just suggest to folks here that are lay people, I'm a physician, the opportunity to learn about reading scientific papers is out there. All the articles on COVID were published free by all the medical journals. So if you want to dive into this, you can see those articles and you can read them. And I'd also recommend the book Science Fictions by Stuart Ritchie, who goes into how studies are not accurate and how to look at a study and see that the data doesn't match the conclusions. And I think we heard the editor say some organizations are requiring the data to be submitted at the time of publication so that you can look at the data and see if the conclusion follows from that data.
Right.
I think people use aspartame unintentionally when they don't know it's in the product, or intentionally for weight loss.
Right.
So we have some new drugs out there, Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Lilly has one, tirzepatide, I think the name. So we can eat, drink, and be merry and take these drugs and lose weight, because I think that's why people take aspartame, because of weight gain.
And actually, there's a lot of work from Sharon Fowler and her group at the University of Texas showing that aspartame is counterproductive with regard to weight gain. The more aspartame you use, the heavier you get. And she's got some good reasoning as to why that happens.
So I'm a physician also. I'm also been involved in taking medical devices through the FDA, also being involved in investment for various organizations on evaluating new products that go through the FDA often, whether it's pharmaceuticals or medical devices. The whole process is difficult to navigate. For example, with pharmaceuticals, there's the orphan drug designation, which was set up so that diseases that were rare could have a faster path to get through the FDA because the numbers that they would have to get statistical significance for the value for the disease is difficult to obtain when you have rare drugs, rare diseases. This has been abused. The way it's been abused is you take something for, say, an ophthalmological disease, and they'll say, they'll take a disease and they'll try to get something through the FDA, and they'll charge, say, $120,000 per year or per dose even. And then what they'll do is once it gets approved, they'll expand the indications, allowing it to go through with less studies now, or post-approval studies, that can then go into other more common diseases. And it's not just in ophthalmology, it's in all kinds of things. In medical devices, the standards are to be as good as what's already out there. So all of a sudden you've got new products coming out that are equal, but maybe slightly better, but they've been approved by the FDA, can they be marketed that way? In medical devices, for example, artificial intelligence, software, medical device software, there are standards and different pathways depending on the degree in which they help physicians or the degree in which they are used for decision making. So you can imagine the complexity of these products and going through these FDAs, and there are FDA advisors that these companies use to try to help figure out which pathway to use and what studies and what's statistically significant and what needs to be done by the companies that are doing the products. This is super complicated. At the same time, you're right, these lobbyists have incredible strength. Now, interestingly, one of the groups I worked with, which was working on funding a lot of these products, was a public organization focused on, appropriateness of care. So when people came and said, I want some money for this drug development, and this drug will cost $100,000 a dose and we'll make this money, we would very quickly go through all the information in a detailed manner and essentially not fund them, because it was publicly inappropriate, because there's so many other diseases and there's so many other ways to use money. Some of these diseases, as you as physicians know, are really rare, and the treatment's really simple. Like, for example, there was a drug that was going to use for, I think it was called Stargazer's disease, which is a rare disease in children, ophthalmological disease. And the treatment they wanted to use was a very dilute betadine. Betadine's been used for decades, just pouring it in the eye before doing cataracts, before they switched the solutions. And they wanted to charge well over $50,000 to $60,000. Meanwhile, yes, it went through the FDA, went through the process of being safe, but we've been using betadine on eyes for probably 30, 40, 50 years. So there's an incredible amount of problems through the FDA. At the same time, I've also done a little work with the NIH in evaluating products. And the people who are on these independent panels to review these products, to see whether they should be funded by federal grants, are incredibly smart. I have to say, by far, I was the stupidest one in my group. And I don't think I'm really that smart, and it wasn't really my field, but these guys were brilliant. They were from all over the country, from Iowa, from MIT, from Harvard, from Stanford, from Florida State. They were just really excellent researchers. The problem with this is that your information and others who were not sponsored didn't have that information wasn't appropriately evaluated. Why? I don't know. There are post-FDA studies, phase 4 studies that are done by the industry or should be done by the industry, whether it's a pharmaceutical or something else. And this information should be coming out and should be evaluated. I just wanted to point that out, how difficult this whole industry is.
I've got one quick question for you before Bob shuts us both off here. I gather you're an ophthalmologist.
I am not. I'm an anesthesiologist.
Oh, you're an anesthesiologist. I was going to ask you whether you've seen an increase in eye problems that you might attribute to aspartame, but okay.
Yeah, thank you.
It's all yours.
I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Ralph for a thought-provoking presentation. I had mentioned that there are plenty of science. There aren't enough, but there are other science opportunities at Chautauqua. I hope you notice that at ours, there's time for you all to ask questions and make comments. And one of the things we've found as the science group is that we do have incredibly talented, knowledgeable people at Chautauqua who volunteer to do talks. Sometimes we get people from outside, but mainly our speakers are us. And I've been so impressed by how smart our audience is and our presenters. We tried about 10 years ago, the science group sponsored a special studies class on the scientific method. And it was hard slogging, but we found that there needs to be more work at all ages on just for people to understand what the scientific method is, and that it's not a vehicle for eternal truth to crop up next week. It's a method for mostly disproving things, but you have to have hypotheses to start with. You have to have models of how things work. It's not just the temperature you can measure today. It's a process. We're promoting that process. We need your help. We don't have enough money to provide free cookies, but we do with your donations. We can do our website. We can do our donation to the Hurlbut Sanctuary for letting us have this spot. And so thank you for coming. Brian Green is going to be talking string theory and the big picture. And go and listen to him and come back next week. Thank you very much.